The reflection staring back from the gilded mirror of the royal dressing room was perfect, and Alexander hated it. The sash of the Order of the Golden Falcon cut diagonally across his chest, a vibrant crimson against the stark white of his ceremonial military dress uniform, pinned in place by medals he hadn't earned on any battlefield. At 26, Crown Prince Alexander of Eldoria was less a man and more a monument, a carefully curated symbol of stability for a Scandinavian nation that prided itself on tradition. He adjusted the collar, feeling the stiff fabric dig into his neck like a garrote. Outside the heavy oak doors, the hum of the annual diplomatic gala was already rising, a polite roar of crystal clinking against flute and the murmur of 100 conversations that said absolutely nothing. He took a breath, inhaling the scent of old wood, lavender polish, and the suffocating weight of expectation. Tonight, he was expected to smile, to shake hands with dignitaries whose names he had memorized from flashcards, and to discuss the macroeconomic trends of the Eurozone without ever admitting that he had no idea what a loaf of bread actually cost in the capital city's market. He walked out, the guards flanking him with practiced invisibility. The grand hall was a sea of black ties and designer gowns, a kaleidoscope of wealth swirling under chandeliers that cost more than most of his subjects would earn in a lifetime. As he descended the grand staircase, the room hushed, then swelled with the respectful applause that always greeted him. It was a sound he had known since birth, a sound that felt less like adoration and more like the static of a television channel tuned to a dead frequency. He moved through the crowd like a shark in an aquarium, efficient and cold. He accepted a glass of champagne he didn't drink. He nodded at the French ambassador's joke he didn't find funny. He listened to a steel magnate complain about labor unions, nodding politely while his mind drifted to the view from his bedroom window, the only part of the kingdom he felt he truly knew. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life, transparent and insubstantial. The breaking point came 40 minutes later, near the buffet line. A young server, no older than 18, was struggling to replace a heavy silver tray of smoked salmon. His hands were shaking, likely from the pressure of being invisible among the powerful. The tray slipped. It didn't fall, but it clattered loudly against the table, sending a few capers rolling onto the pristine floor. The server froze, terror widening his eyes. A nearby protocol officer immediately descended on the boy, his voice a harsh whisper of reprimand. Alexander stepped forward, his instinct to intervene, to help, to say it was fine. But before he could take a second step, his personal secretary, a man named Hugo who viewed spontaneity as a disease, gently touched his elbow. "Your Highness," Hugo murmured, guiding him away. "The Prime Minister of Japan is waiting near the orchestra." Alexander looked back. The server was on his knees, frantically picking up capers, humiliated. Alexander had the power to command armies, yet he wasn't allowed to help a boy pick up a fish garnish. The absurdity of it clawed at his throat. That night, the argument with King Edvard was not loud. The walls of the palace were too thick for shouting, and the temperament of the royal family too icy for tantrums. It was a cold, precise dismantling of the status quo. They stood in the king's private study, a room smelling of pipe tobacco and centuries of ink. King Edvard sat behind his mahogany desk, looking every inch the monarch, though his eyes betrayed a deep, weary affection for his only son. Alexander stood by the fireplace, the flames casting long, dancing shadows that made him look ready to burn the room down. "You speak of duty," Alexander said, his voice steady but intense. "But what is my duty, father? To be a mannequin? To wave from a balcony? I read the reports you send me. I know the GDP, the unemployment statistics, the trade deficits. But I don't know the people. I don't know what it feels like to be tired after a shift. I don't know what it feels like to be afraid of losing a job. How can I rule them if I am a different species?" "You are a different species," King Edvard replied, tapping his pen on the leather blotter. "You are a king in waiting. Your distance is what preserves the mystique. It is what keeps the monarchy stable. You cannot descend into the mud and expect to remain spotless." "I don't want to be spotless," Alexander countered, stepping closer. "I want to be real. I want to know if I have any worth outside of this title." If you took away the crown, the money, the guards, who am I? Am I capable? Or am I just a genetic lottery winner? He paused, softening his tone. I need to know that I can survive the world on my own terms. Give me 1 month. No guards. No protocol. No access to the royal treasury. Just me. The king looked at him for a long time. He saw the stubborn set of Alexander's jaw, a trait inherited from the late queen. He saw the desperation of a bird that had grown too large for its gilded cage. Finally, Edvard sighed, a sound that seemed to age him 10 years in a second. 1 month, the king said. But we will not do this in Europe. You would be recognized in a day. You will go to New York. In that city, everyone is too obsessed with their own reflection to notice a prince. The transformation was clinical. The next morning, Alexander boarded a commercial flight, not a private jet. He flew economy class. It was the first time he had ever sat in a seat that didn't recline fully. He wore jeans that felt stiff and a hooded sweatshirt that made him feel dangerously anonymous. His passport read, Alexander Larson, a generic name for a generic man. When he landed at JFK, the assault on his senses was instantaneous. The air smelled of jet fuel and damp pavement. The immigration line was a 2-hour ordeal of shuffling feet and crying babies. For the first time in his life, no one rushed to open a lane for him. He was jostled, bumped, and ignored. It was exhilarating. He had arranged the job through a back-channel connection of the royal family. A favor called in to the owner of the Grand Continental Hotel, who was told only that the son of a wealthy European friend needed to learn the value of $1. He wasn't given a management position. He was given a uniform and a place at the bottom of the totem pole. The Grand Continental was a beast of a building, a limestone monolith in Midtown Manhattan that catered to the whims of the global elite. It was a place where billionaires came to sleep and millionaires came to network. Alexander walked into the employee entrance, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind him, effectively sealing off his past life. The locker room smelled of industrial bleach and stale sweat. He was assigned a locker that wouldn't close properly and a uniform that was slightly too large in the shoulders. His supervisor was Mr. Thompson, a man who seemed to vibrate with a constant low-level panic. Thompson was short, balding, and possessed the unique ability to sweat profusely even in an air-conditioned room. He looked at Alexander, now Alex, with immediate skepticism. "You're the referral," Thompson said, not looking up from his clipboard. "Listen to me, Larson. I don't care who your daddy knows. This is the front line. We are the face of the Grand Continental. If you smile with teeth. If a guest asks for the moon, you find a ladder. You are not here to think. You are here to serve. Am I clear?" "Crystal clear, sir," Alexander said. "Don't call me sir. I work for a living. Call me Mr. Thompson." The first week was a blur of physical and mental exhaustion that Alexander had never conceived of. His legs ached from standing for 8 hours straight. His face hurt from the forced smile. But more than the physical toll, it was the psychological shift that staggered him. He was invisible. Not the invisible of the palace guards who stepped back to give him space, but the invisibility of a piece of furniture. Guests looked through him, not at him. They handed him trash to throw away without breaking their conversation. They snapped their fingers. But amidst the humiliation, Alexander found something he had been starving for: humanity. He found it in the small, stolen moments. He found it in Maria, the elderly housekeeper who hummed opera while she polished the marble floors at 3 a.m. On his third night, he saw her sitting in the break room, rubbing her swollen ankles. Without thinking, he went to the vending machine, using the crumpled dollar bills he had earned from his first tips, and bought her a bottle of water. "For the opera singer," he said, sliding it across the table. Maria looked up, surprised. Her face was a map of wrinkles, worn deep by years of hard labor, but her eyes were sharp. "You're new," she said, her accent thick and warm. "You don't look like a bellboy. You have soft hands." "I use a lot of lotion," Alexander joked, sitting down opposite her. "You have sad eyes too," she observed, twisting the cap off the water. "Rich people have sad eyes." Poor people have tired eyes. You look like you are running away from something. Maybe I'm running towards something, he replied. Just don't run into Mr. Thompson. She laughed, a raspy sound. He eats soft boys like you for breakfast. Alexander didn't get fired, but he earned a nickname, the Turtle. It wasn't because he was lazy, though that was what Thompson assumed. It was because he cared too much about the details. The efficiency of a hotel relies on speed. Check them in, check them out, turn the room over. Alexander, however, saw the stories behind the faces. When a young couple arrived for their honeymoon looking exhausted and terrified because their luggage was lost by the airline, Alexander didn't just give them a room key. He spent 20 minutes on the phone with the airline, using a commanding tone he had learned from generals to track down the bags. All while the line at the front desk grew longer and Thompson glared daggers at him from the back office. When the bags arrived, the couple was in tears of gratitude. Thompson, however, only saw the cue. You are clogging the arteries of this operation, Larson. Thompson hissed at him after the shift. We are a machine. You are a cog. Stop trying to be a hero and just process the credit cards. Alexander took the criticism in stride. He was learning that in the real world, competence was often measured by speed rather than quality. He was learning that people like Thompson were driven by fear of their bosses, fear of losing control. And he was learning that he actually liked the work. There was a satisfaction in solving a problem for a guest that was immediate and tangible, unlike the abstract treaties he signed back home. By the third week, the novelty had worn off, replaced by a gritty determination. He lived in a cramped studio apartment in Queens that smelled of boiled cabbage and had a radiator that clanged like a dying engine. He took the subway, learning to sleep while standing up. He ate $1 slices of pizza. He was tired, he was anonymous, and for the first time in his life he was free. He wrote letters to his father, not on royal stationery, but on cheap lined paper. The people are not just statistics, Father, he wrote. They are tired. They are angry. But they are also incredibly resilient. I am learning more about governance by carrying suitcases than I ever did in the Privy Council. Then came the morning of the incident. The weather in New York had turned foul, a gray sheet of rain lashing against the glass doors of the lobby. The atmosphere inside the hotel was tense. Bad weather meant canceled flights, which meant angry guests, which meant a miserable staff. Alexander was manning the main terminal, his eyes scanning the reservation list, when the revolving doors spun with an aggressive velocity. He looked up to see a man storming in, trailing a wake of wet assistants and expensive leather luggage. It was Richard Sterling. Alexander recognized him instantly, not from the hotel's VIP list, but from the Interpol briefings he used to read during his boring Security Council meetings. Sterling was a property tycoon whose empire was built on a foundation of shell companies and offshore accounts. He was a bully in a bespoke suit. Sterling didn't walk to the desk, he marched. He bypassed the velvet rope, shoved past a family of 4 waiting to check out, and slapped a platinum card onto the marble counter with a sound like a gunshot. Suite 402, Sterling barked, not bothering to make eye contact. It smells like cleaning fluid. I want to move.
Présidentielle suite.
Now, Alexander looked at the man. He saw the arrogance, the disdain, the absolute certainty that money bought the right to be inhuman. He also looked at his screen. A subtle alert blinked in the corner of the reservation system. A silent hold notification. It was a flag placed by federal authorities, indicating that if this credit card was used, law enforcement was to be notified immediately, but the subject was not to be alerted. This was the test. Alexander the receptionist should have panicked. Alexander the receptionist should have called Thompson. But Alexander the Crown Prince saw the battlefield clearly. He knew that if he processed the move quickly, Sterling would go up to the presidential suite, potentially use a private exit, or destroy evidence before the authorities could arrive. The police needed time. Alexander looked up, his face a mask of calm, professional incompetence. I apologize, Mr. Sterling, he said, his voice slow and deliberate. My system seems to be lagging today. If you could just give me a moment to reboot the terminal. Reboot? Sterling's face twisted. Do I look like I have time for a reboot? Do you know who I am? I believe you are Mr. Sterling, Alexander said, typing nonsense into the keyboard to simulate activity. But the computer is quite old, sir. It has a mind of its own. You're an idiot, Sterling spat. A slow, incompetent idiot. Alexander didn't flinch. He just kept typing, watching the clock on the wall ticking away the seconds. He needed 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes for the silent alarm to route to the NYPD and for the response team to navigate Midtown traffic. I am trying my best, sir, Alexander said, dropping his voice to a pitch he knew would irritate the man further. 3 minutes, Sterling screamed, attracting the attention of the entire lobby. I have been standing here for 3 minutes while you peck at that keyboard like a chicken. Where is the manager? Thompson was already running over, his face pale. Mr. Sterling. So sorry. What is the problem? The problem, Sterling pointed a thick finger at Alexander, is that you have hired a mental defective to run your front desk. Thompson turned on Alexander, panic in his eyes. Alex, just give him the key. Override the system. I can't, Mr. Thompson, Alexander said, looking his boss in the eye. The system is frozen. It wasn't frozen. Alexander's finger was hovering over the enter key, but he wouldn't press it. Not yet. He could see the vein throbbing in Sterling's temple. He could feel the tension in the room stretching like a rubber band about to snap. He needed to buy more time, and he knew the only way to do it was to make himself the target of Sterling's rage. He had to be the lightning rod. Perhaps, Alexander suggested helpfully, if you tried a different card, Mr. Sterling, sometimes the chip readers are sensitive to moisture. That was the spark. Sterling's face turned a violent shade of purple. He reached out, grabbing a ceramic cup of hot espresso that had been left on the counter by a previous guest. You insolent little. Alexander saw the motion. He could have dodged. He had been trained in Krav Maga by Israeli Special Forces. He could have caught Sterling's wrist and pinned him to the counter in 2 seconds. But Alex, the receptionist, couldn't do that. Alex, the receptionist, had to stand there. The cup flew. The hot liquid splashed across Alexander's chest, searing through the thin fabric of his uniform. The cup shattered against the marble floor with a sound that stopped the heart of the hotel. The heat was the first thing to register. A sharp, scalding shock that radiated across his chest, soaking through the thin cotton of the uniform shirt and biting into the skin beneath. It was followed instantly by the smell, the rich, roasted aroma of Colombian Arabica that, in any other context, would have been welcoming, but now smelled like humiliation. The shatter of the ceramic cup on the marble floor echoed like a gunshot in a canyon, a violent punctuation mark that severed the ambient hum of the Grand Continental lobby. For a heartbeat, the world simply stopped. The piano player in the corner froze, his fingers hovering over a minor chord. The concierge dropped a phone receiver. The chatter of the afternoon tea crowd died in their throats. Alexander didn't move. He didn't wipe the dark stain spreading across his heart. He didn't gasp. He stood with the unnatural stillness of a statue, a discipline drilled into him by years of standing at attention during national anthems and royal funerals. His eyes, however, were not the eyes of a servant. They were locked onto Richard Sterling, analyzing the man not as a guest, but as a threat assessment. He saw the heaving chest, the vein throbbing in the man's neck, the triumphant, ugly sneer of a bully who believes he has just established dominance. Now, Sterling hissed, his voice trembling with the adrenaline of his own rage. Do you hear me now, you deaf mute? I said I want the manager. I want you gone. I want you out on the street where garbage like you belongs. Mr. Thompson materialized from the back office as if summoned by the devil himself. He took in the scene, the broken porcelain, the coffee-drenched employee, the furious billionaire, and his survival instinct kicked in. It was a cowardly instinct, one that always punched down. Oh my God! Thompson gasped, rushing forward, his hands fluttering uselessly. Mr. Sterling, I am devastated. Truly devastated. This is unacceptable. He turned to Alexander, his face twisting into a mask of frantic cruelty. Larson, what did you do? Did you provoke him? Look at this mess. You've ruined a guest suit. You've ruined the floor. He didn't ruin my suit, Sterling corrected, sneering. He ruined my mood, and that is far more expensive. Of course, Thompson stammered, sweating profusely. Larson, get out from behind that desk. You're finished. Do you hear me? Fired. Immediate effect. I want your badge. I want you out of this building in 2 minutes, or I'm calling security to throw you out. Alexander looked at Thompson. In the past 3 weeks, he had watched this man berate maids for missing a spot of dust and grovel before cheating spouses who tipped well. He felt a profound sense of disappointment, not for himself, but for the lack of spine in a man charged with leading others. I cannot leave just yet, Mr. Thompson, Alexander said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a timbre that was strangely at odds with his soaked appearance. It was the voice used to address parliaments, stripped of its amplification but retaining its weight. You can and you will, Sterling shouted, slamming his hand on the marble counter again. I don't want to see your face. Move. Alexander glanced at the clock on the wall behind the guests. 1 minute, 45 seconds. The silent alarm had been triggered. The NYPD response time for a code red priority at a landmark hotel was estimated at 4 minutes. He was close, but he needed to hold the line just a little longer. If Sterling left the lobby now, he would head to the elevators. If he got to the elevators, he might see the text message warning him that his accounts were being frozen. If he saw that, he would bolt for the service exit. Mr. Sterling, Alexander said, deliberately stepping to the side to block the direct path to the elevators, effectively using his own body as a barrier. I understand your frustration. However, per hotel policy, we must document the incident before you proceed. An injury report for the hot liquid. I'm not injured, you imbecile, Sterling roared, stepping forward, invading Alexander's personal space. The tycoon was a large man, heavy with the weight of indulgence, and he used his size to intimidate. The only person who is going to be injured is you if you don't get out of my way. Sterling raised a hand. It wasn't a closed fist, but a backhand, intended to slap Alexander aside like an annoying gnat. It was a gesture of supreme disrespect. The air in the lobby grew thin. Thompson squeaked, covering his eyes, but the blow never landed. The sound that interrupted them wasn't a shout. It was the violent, synchronized crash of the main revolving doors being thrown open, not by the mechanism but by force. A gust of wind and rain swept into the climate-controlled sanctuary of the lobby, bringing with it the raw, chaotic energy of the storm outside. 6 men entered. They moved with a fluidity and precision that was terrifying to behold. They wore dark tactical raincoats, soaked and glistening, with earpieces coiled behind their ears. They didn't look like hotel security. They didn't look like police. They looked like predators. They fanned out instantly, securing the exits, their eyes scanning the mezzanine, the corners, the crowd. Behind them walked a single figure. He was an older man, silver-haired, dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that seemed immune to the weather. He walked with a cane, not out of infirmity, but as an accessory of command. On his lapel, a small pin in the shape of a golden falcon caught the light of the chandeliers. It was Victor, the High Ambassador of the Kingdom of Eldoria. Sterling froze, his hands still half raised. The sudden influx of hard-faced men with bulges under their coats that suggested firearms had a sobering effect on his rage. What is this? Sterling demanded, his voice cracking slightly. Who are you people? This is a private hotel. Security. Victor didn't even blink in Sterling's direction. He treated the billionaire with the same regard one might give a piece of gum on a sidewalk. His eyes were locked on the coffee-stained young man standing behind the counter. The lobby fell into a silence deeper and heavier than before. It was the silence of a held breath. Victor walked across the marble floor, his cane tapping a rhythmic cadence. Click, click, click. He approached the reception desk. Mr. Thompson, trembling, stepped forward, assuming this was some high-level dignitary he had failed to greet. Sir, I apologize for the chaos. Thompson began, his voice shaking. We had a rogue employee. Victor raised a gloved hand, silencing Thompson without looking at him. He stopped 3 feet from Alexander. He looked at the stain on the shirt. He looked at the wet hair. His expression tightened, a flash of protective anger crossing his stoic features, but he suppressed it instantly. Then the impossible happened. The distinguished diplomat, a man who had dined with presidents and negotiated treaties, placed his cane on the floor. He stepped back with his left foot and sank down. He knelt. It was not a casual crouch. It was a formal, deep genuflection. His head bowed low, his posture one of absolute, unwavering servitude. "I am late, Your Highness," Victor said. His voice was clear, resonant, and filled with a profound shame. "The traffic on Fifth Avenue was unforeseen. I offer my life as penance for this indignity." The words hung in the air, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Your Highness." Sterling's mouth fell open. His brain tried to process the information, but the cognitive dissonance was too great. The boy was a receptionist. He was wearing a name tag that said, Alex, trainee. He had coffee on his shirt. "What?" Sterling whispered, the blood draining from his face. "What did you call him?" Alexander sighed. It was a long, weary exhalation. He reached into the pocket of his stained trousers and pulled out a plain white handkerchief. He wiped a droplet of espresso from his chin, his movements slowing down, shedding the frantic energy of the service industry. He rolled his shoulders back, standing to his full height. Suddenly, the uniform didn't look like a costume anymore. He wore it like armor. "Rise, Victor," Alexander said. The tone was soft, but it wasn't the voice of Alex. It was the voice of Crown Prince Alexander. It was a voice that expected obedience without having to raise its volume. Victor stood immediately, retrieving his cane. "The car is waiting, sire. The extraction team is in position." Alexander nodded, then turned his gaze to Sterling. For Sterling, it was like looking into the sun. The lazy eyes of the receptionist were gone. In their place was a gaze of icy, aristocratic judgment. It was a look that had been refined by Alexander's ancestors for 500 years. A look that stripped a man down to his soul and found him wanting. "You," Sterling stammered, stepping back, bumping into the counter. "You're a prince?" "Alexander of the House of Eldoria," the prince replied calmly. "And you, Mr. Sterling, are out of time." "Time?" Sterling laughed nervously, a high-pitched, hysterical sound. "What is this? A prank? Reality TV? You can't be a prince. You're fetching my keys. I'll sue you. I'll buy your little country." Alexander stepped out from behind the counter. The barrier was gone. He walked until he was inches from Sterling. Despite Sterling's physical bulk, Alexander seemed to tower over him. "You asked why I was slow, Mr. Sterling," Alexander said conversational, as if explaining a dinner menu. "You called me lazy. You called me incompetent. But I was not struggling with the computer. I was reading a red notice from Interpol." Sterling's eyes widened. "What? Money laundering, fraud, racketeering, and funding of separatist groups in Eastern Europe?" Alexander listed the charges from memory. "The notification popped up on my screen the moment you swiped your card. The protocol is to call the authorities and keep the subject on the premises. If I had checked you in, you would have gone to your room. You might have seen the news. You might have run." Alexander leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Sterling could hear. "So, I decided to be the one thing a man like you cannot tolerate. An inconvenience. I knew if I made you wait, if I made you angry, your ego would glue you to this floor. You wouldn't leave until you had crushed me. Your arrogance was your cage, Mr. Sterling, and I just locked the door." As the last word left Alexander's lips, the wail of sirens pierced the air outside. Not one siren, but many. Blue and red lights began to flash against the rain-streaked windows, painting the lobby in a strobe of emergency colors. The revolving doors spun again. This time it was the NYPD, 4 officers in tactical gear, followed by 2 detectives in suits. They moved directly toward Sterling. "Richard Sterling?" the lead detective barked, holding up a badge. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud and international money laundering. Hands behind your back. Now." Sterling looked from the police to Alexander. You set me up, you little rat. I'll destroy you." "You will try," Alexander said, turning his back on the man. "But I suspect you will find it difficult to litigate from a federal penitentiary." As the officers wrestled a screaming Sterling into handcuffs, forcing his face down onto the very marble floor he had claimed to own, the lobby remained in a state of shock. Guests were filming with their phones. The concierge was gaping. But the most terrified person in the room was Mr. Thompson. The manager was pressing himself against the back wall, trying to merge with the wallpaper. He looked as if he was about to vomit. He had just fired a crown prince. He had screamed at him. He had threatened him. He saw his career, his pension, and his reputation disintegrating in real time. Alexander saw him. He adjusted his cuffs, ignoring the coffee stain, and walked over to the trembling manager. Victor followed a step behind, looking at Thompson with a gaze that suggested he was considering having the man deported. "Your Highness," Thompson whimpered, his knees actually knocking together. "Please. I didn't know. I swear on my mother's life. If I had known. The coffee. I'll drink it off the floor myself. Please." Alexander raised a hand, stopping the flow of abject begging. He looked at Thompson, studying the sweat on the man's brow. He felt no anger, only a weary pity. "Stand up straight, Thompson," Alexander said. Thompson straightened, shaking. "You are very good at logistics," Alexander said. "You know how to run a schedule. You know how to maximize room turnover. Those are skills." Thank you, Your Highness," Thompson breathed, hope flickering in his eyes. "But you are a terrible leader," Alexander continued, his voice hardening. "You lead by fear. You protect the strong and you sacrifice the weak. Today you were ready to throw a young employee to the wolves because a rich man raised his voice. You didn't ask what happened. You didn't defend your team. You just folded." Thompson stared at the floor, shame burning his face crimson. "I am not going to have you fired," Alexander said. Thompson looked up, tears in his eyes. "Because firing you would be too easy. And frankly, I don't own this hotel. But I will tell the owner, who is a personal friend of my father, what I saw. Whether you keep your job is up to him. But if you do stay, I suggest you learn the difference between service and servitude. One is a profession. The other is a lack of dignity." Alexander turned away, leaving Thompson to his fate. He signaled to Victor, "Let's go." As they moved toward the door, the sea of staff and guests parted. No one spoke. They just watched the transformation. The boy who had carried their bags was now walking with the stride of a king. But just as he reached the revolving doors, Alexander stopped. He pivoted, scanning the perimeter of the lobby. He was looking for someone. He saw her near the service elevators. Maria, the elderly cleaner, was clutching her mop handle, her eyes wide with shock. She had seen everything. She looked terrified, uncertain if the boy she had shared her sandwich with was a lie, a hallucination, or a stranger. Alexander deviated from his path, ignoring Victor's subtle gesture to keep moving. He walked straight to Maria. The crowd murmured. Why was the prince talking to the cleaning lady? He stopped in front of her. She looked down, afraid to meet his eyes. "Maria," he said gently. She looked up slowly. "Alex?" she whispered. "Or, Your Highness?" "Alex," he smiled. It was a genuine smile, the first one he had worn in hours. "Always Alex to you." He reached out and took her rough, calloused hands in his own. The contrast was stark. The young, smooth hands of royalty holding the worn, work-hardened hands of a lifetime of labor. "You told me once that kindness is mistaken for weakness in this city," Alexander said, loud enough for the nearby staff to hear. "You were wrong. Your kindness was the only strength I found in this building. When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was tired, you made me laugh. That is not weakness, Maria. That is nobility." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the only thing of value he had on him. a small, heavy coin he carried for luck. It was solid gold, minted with the profile of his grandfather. He pressed it into her palm and closed her fingers over it. "This is not a tip," he said softly. "This is a promise. If you or your grandchildren ever need anything, education, medical care, a ticket to see the world, you bring this to the Eldorian embassy. They will know what it means. You are under my protection now." Maria's eyes filled with tears. She tried to curtsy, her knees stiff with age, but Alexander held her up. "No," he whispered. "Friends do not bow to each other." He squeezed her hand one last time, then turned and walked away. Victor opened the door. The cold air rushed in, but Alexander didn't feel it. He walked out into the rain, where a sleek black limousine waited at the curb, its flags fluttering in the wind. The lazy receptionist was gone. The prince had returned. But as the heavy door of the limousine thudded shut, sealing him back into the world of silence and safety, Alexander looked out the tinted window at the hotel one last time. He knew he would never be the same. He had broken the glass. He had felt the world. And now he had a kingdom to change. The transition from the chaotic, rain-slicked pavement of Midtown Manhattan to the hermetically sealed silence of the Royal Gulf Stream was not just a change in location. It was a form of decompression sickness. Alexander sat in the cream-colored leather seat, watching the skyline of New York recede into the gray soup of the storm clouds. The engines hummed a lullaby of supreme engineering, a sound designed to make the world outside disappear, but Alexander couldn't stop his hands from trembling. He looked down at them. They were scrubbed clean. The coffee stain was gone, replaced by the scent of expensive lavender soap from the airport lounge's private suite. He was wearing a cashmere sweater and dark trousers provided by Victor's team, the uniform of the leisure class. But beneath the soft fabric, his skin still felt the phantom burn of the hot espresso, a physical memory of the moment he chose dignity over safety. Across the aisle, Ambassador Victor sat with his laptop open, already managing the fallout. "The press release has been drafted, Your Highness," Victor said, his voice low and respectful, treating the air in the cabin as if it were sacred. "We are framing your time at the Grand Continental as an intensive sociological study regarding labor dynamics in the service sector." It sounds academic, dignified. The tabloids are already running with stories about the undercover prince. Public sentiment is polling overwhelmingly positive. They are calling you the people's prince. A bit cliché, but effective. Alexander turned from the window. "Is that what we are doing, Victor? Spinning it?" "We are managing the narrative, sire," Victor replied, not looking up from his screen. "The truth is messy. The truth is you were screamed at by a criminal and nearly assaulted. The crown does not get assaulted. The crown observes. The crown bled today," Alexander murmured, almost to himself, "or at least it got burned." He leaned his head back against the headrest, closing his eyes. He didn't want to hear about polling numbers. He wanted to think about Maria. He wondered if she was still holding the coin. He wondered if Mr. Thompson was currently hyperventilating in his office, or if he was already back to yelling at the bellboys, having learned nothing. The tragedy of the real world he had just escaped was that it didn't stop just because a prince left the building. The machine kept grinding. And for the first time in his life, Alexander felt the crushing weight of his own privilege not as a gift, but as a barrier preventing him from staying to fix the machine. The flight to Eldoria took 7 hours. Alexander slept fitfully, dreaming of revolving doors that wouldn't open and corridors that stretched into infinity. When he woke, the view outside had shifted from the vertical concrete canyons of New York to the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Eldorian Alps. The landscape was breathtaking, a painting of white and slate gray, pristine and untouched. It was the landscape of his childhood, but looking at it now, after the grime and noise of the city, it felt sterile. It looked cold. The landing at the Royal Air Force Base was a choreographed ballet of protocol. As the wheels touched down, Alexander felt the invisible cage descend around him once more. The door opened to a blast of biting Arctic air. At the bottom of the stairs, a regiment of the Royal Guard stood at attention, their breath misting in the air, their bayonets gleaming. A red carpet had been rolled out across the tarmac, defying the snow. "Welcome home, Your Highness," the base commander shouted, saluting sharply. Alexander nodded, his face settling into the mask he had worn for 26 years. "Thank you, Commander." He was ushered into the back of a black armored sedan, part of a motorcade that swept him toward the Winter Palace. The streets of the capital, Oakhaven, were clean and orderly. The buildings were historic, pastel-colored facades with slate roofs. People stopped on the sidewalks to wave as the motorcade passed. Alexander waved back automatically, the royal wave, wrist-stiff, motion economical. But inside, he felt a fraudulence he hadn't expected. These people were waving at a symbol, at a suit, at a bloodline. They weren't waving at him. They didn't know him. They didn't know he knew how to fix a jammed keycard reader or how to calm down a weeping bride. They only knew the statue. The Winter Palace loomed ahead, a fortress of gray stone and iron gates. It was magnificent and terrifying. As the heavy doors closed behind him, the silence of the palace fell like a shroud. It was a different kind of silence than the hotel lobby. The hotel lobby's silence was pregnant with waiting. The palace's silence was the silence of a museum, where life was something that had happened a long time ago. "His Majesty is expecting you in the solar," the chamberlain announced, taking Alexander's coat. Alexander didn't go to his room to freshen up. He didn't change. He walked straight through the great hall, his footsteps echoing on the checkerboard marble floors that were polished to a mirror shine. Floors that reminded him, with a pang of guilt, of Maria on her hands and knees. King Edvard was standing by the massive fireplace in the solar, a room lined with books bound in calfskin. The king looked older than Alexander remembered, though it had only been a month. The burdens of state were etching deeper lines around his eyes. He was holding a glass of sherry, staring into the flames. "You look tired," the king said without turning around. "I've been working, father," Alexander replied, stopping in the center of the room. The king turned. His eyes swept over his son, analyzing him. He saw the new set of the shoulders, a certain tension in the jaw that hadn't been there before. He saw that the boyish softness was gone, burned away by the friction of reality. "I heard the reports," Edvard said, walking to his desk and pouring a second glass of sherry. He held it out. "Sterling, a nasty piece of work. The Prime Minister is pleased. We've seized Sterling's assets in our banks. It's a good win for the Treasury." Alexander took the glass but didn't drink. "Is that all it is? A win for the Treasury?" "It is a win for justice, Alexander," the king said, sitting down heavily. "And a win for you. You went out, you saw the world, you caught a criminal. The experiment was a success. Now you can return to your duties with a clear head." "My head isn't clear," Alexander said, his voice rising slightly. "It's full of noise. You told me the world outside was chaotic, that the monarchy was the order that held back the tide. But that's not what I saw. I saw a system that crushes people. I saw a man like Sterling treat human beings like furniture because he knew there were no consequences. And I saw good people, people who work harder in a day than I have in my life, swallow their pride just to feed their families. That is the nature of the world," Edvard said dismissively. "There are hierarchies. There have always been hierarchies. But we are at the top of the hierarchy." Alexander slammed the glass down on the side table, the liquid sloshing over the rim. "If the people at the top don't look down with empathy, then the hierarchy is just tyranny with better manners. I didn't just catch a criminal, father. I had to let a man humiliate me to do it. I had to stand there and take it. Do you know what that feels like? To be powerless?" "No," the king said quietly. "I am a king. I am never powerless." "Then you are blind," Alexander countered, "because half of your subjects feel powerless every single day. And if you don't understand that feeling, you can't rule them. You can only occupy them." The room went silent. The crackle of the fire was the only sound. It was the first time Alexander had ever spoken to his father not as a subject, but as an equal. He expected anger. He expected the king to summon the guards or dismiss him. Instead, King Edvard smiled. It was a faint, dry smile. "So," the king said softly. The puppy finally grew teeth. Alexander blinked, the adrenaline of his outburst fading into confusion. "What? I didn't send you to New York to learn how to check people into a hotel, Alexander," the king said, leaning back in his chair. "I sent you there to get angry. A king who is content is a dangerous thing. A king must be dissatisfied. He must look at his kingdom and see the cracks. Before you left, you were bored. You were a decoration. Now you are furious. Good. Hold on to that fury. You will need it." "Need it for what?" "For the gala tonight," the king said, his tone shifting back to business. "The Duchess of Vanaheim is here. The council is pushing for a reduction in the public health budget. The trade unions are threatening a strike. The world didn't stop while you were playing receptionist. Go change. Put on your uniform. Tonight, you don't have to carry luggage. You have to carry the court." The transition back to court life was violent in its subtlety. 2 hours later, Alexander stood in the Hall of Mirrors, once again encased in the white ceremonial uniform, the sash of the golden falcon cutting across his chest. The weight of the medals felt heavier now, almost mocking. "What is this one for?" he thought, touching a gold star. "Attendance?" The gala was a sea of diamonds and fake laughter. The air smelled of expensive perfume and old money. Alexander moved through the crowd, but his perception had permanently shifted. Before, he saw faces and titles. Now he saw the mechanics. He saw the waiter sweating as he balanced a tray of champagne flutes, terrified of dropping one. He saw the subtle wince of the footman whose shoes were too tight. He saw the invisible labor that propped up the fantasy of the aristocracy. The Duchess of Vanaheim cornered him near the orchestra. She was a woman of immense wealth and zero perspective, draped in emeralds that could have funded a hospital wing. "Oh, Your Highness," she trilled, clutching his arm with a manicured claw. "We missed you so. I heard you were in America. Dreadful place, isn't it? So loud. And the service. I went to New York last year, and the waiter at Le Bernardin actually spoke to me without being spoken to. Can you imagine?" Alexander looked at her. He thought of Maria sharing her sandwich. He thought of the exhausted young couple on their honeymoon. "Perhaps he was just trying to be human, Duchess," Alexander said coldly. "Human?" The Duchess laughed, as if he had told a joke. "My dear boy, staff aren't human. They are functionaries. If I wanted conversation, I would bring a parrot." A flash of heat went through Alexander's chest, reminiscent of the coffee burn. He opened his mouth to eviscerate her, to strip away her pretension with the sharp edge of his new perspective. But he stopped. He saw his father watching him from across the room. The king's eyes were unreadable, but the message was clear. Control yourself. Use the fury, don't let it use you. Alexander forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "If you will excuse me, Duchess, I believe the Prime Minister is waving at me." He walked away, his heart pounding. He realized then that the fight wasn't going to be as simple as arresting a bad guy in a lobby. The bad guys here were the system itself. They were the traditions, the assumptions, the casual dehumanization that his own family had presided over for centuries. The breaking point of the evening came during the banquet. The long table was set with Sèvres porcelain and silver cutlery. 50 of the most powerful people in Eldoria were eating venison and discussing the problem of the trade unions. They want a 7% wage increase, the Minister of Labor was saying, cutting his meat with surgical precision. It's absurd. It would bankrupt the small business sector. These people don't understand economics. They think money grows on trees. They think money comes from work, Alexander said. The table went quiet. All eyes turned to the prince. "Excuse me, Your Highness?" the minister asked, his fork hovering halfway to his mouth. "I said, they think money comes from work," Alexander repeated, his voice projecting clearly down the long table. "Because for them, it does. They trade hours of their lives, their health, their time with their children, for a wage that barely covers the cost of living in the city we are sitting in. You speak of 7% as if it is a fortune. For a cleaner at the Grand Continental, 7% is the difference between buying medicine or buying food. The king continued eating, not looking up, but Alexander saw the corner of his mouth twitch. "With all due respect, Your Highness," the minister said, a condescending smile plastering his face. "Running a country is not like checking into a hotel. The complexities of macroeconomics." Crash. A young footman, no older than 19, had been pouring red wine into the glass of General Kalin. Distracted by the tension at the table, his hand slipped. The bottle hit the rim of the glass, shattering it. Red wine, dark as blood, spilled across the general's pristine white dress uniform and soaked into the tablecloth. The silence was absolute. It was the Grand Continental lobby all over again. The general stood up, his face purple. "You clumsy oaf! Look what you've done!" The footman was paralyzed. He was shaking so hard the bottle rattled in his hand. The head steward was already rushing over, his face a mask of fury, ready to drag the boy away and likely fire him before the main course was finished. I am so sorry, sir. The boy stammered, tears welling in his eyes. "Get out of my sight!" the general roared. Alexander stood up. The sound of his chair scraping against the floor was loud. "Leave him," Alexander commanded. The head steward froze. The general looked at the prince, confused. "Your Highness, the boy is incompetence personified. He has ruined the vintage." Alexander walked around the table. He didn't walk like a prince inspecting the troops. He walked like a man who knew exactly how slippery a floor could be. He reached the trembling footman. "Give me the bottle," Alexander said gently. The boy looked at him, terrified. He handed the bottle to the prince. Alexander took it. Then he grabbed a napkin from the table. He turned to General Kalin. "It's just wine, General," Alexander said, his voice hard. "It washes out. Fear does not." Alexander turned to the footman. "What is your name?" "Elias, Your Highness." "Elias," Alexander said, loud enough for the Duchess, the minister, and the king to hear. "Go to the kitchen. Tell the chef to prepare a fresh plate. Then take a 10-minute break. Breathe. You are not fired. In fact, you are handling the pressure of this room better than most of the people sitting at this table." "But, Your Highness," the head steward protested weakly. "If Elias is fired," Alexander said, looking at the steward, "then I will personally pour the rest of this bottle into your lap. Do we understand each other?" The steward paled. "Yes, Your Highness." "Go, Elias," Alexander said softly. The boy bowed, a clumsy, frantic thing, and fled the room. Alexander stood there for a moment, holding the wine bottle. He looked at the table of shocked dignitaries. He looked at his father. King Edvard raised his glass of water in a silent toast. Alexander sat back down. "As we were saying, Minister," he said, placing the bottle on the table, "about that 7% wage increase. I think we can find the budget for it. Perhaps we can cut the budget for gala dinners. I find the wine here is entirely too expensive." The rest of the dinner was eaten in a state of terrified politeness. No one argued with the prince. Later that night, Alexander stood on the balcony of his chambers, overlooking the sleeping capital. The snow was falling again, silent and relentless. The cold bit at his face, but he welcomed it. He felt awake. He felt alive. He realized that his time as Alex hadn't been an escape from his life. It had been the preparation for it. He wasn't just the crown prince anymore. He was the man who knew what it cost to be the subject. There was a knock on the door. It was Victor. "Your Highness," Victor said, stepping out onto the balcony. "The king has retired, but he left a message." "What is it?" "He said that the council meeting is tomorrow at 9 a.m. He expects you to chair it." Victor paused. "He also said, don't let the wine stain set." Alexander smiled. "Tell him I'll be there." "And Victor?" "Yes, sire. Find out where Elias the footman lives. Send a hamper to his family. And make sure the head steward knows that Elias is under my personal supervision. Consider it done." Victor turned to leave but stopped. "If I may, Your Highness, you have changed the atmosphere of the palace in 6 hours. Some are calling it reckless. Others are saying the king has finally arrived." Victor bowed and left. Alexander looked out at the city lights shimmering through the snow. He wasn't the king yet, but for the first time he could see the path. It wouldn't be paved with gold and silence. It would be paved with conflict, with noise, and with the messy, beautiful reality of people. He took a deep breath of the freezing air. "Let's get to work," he whispered to the night. The council chamber of the Winter Palace was designed to intimidate. It was a cavernous, windowless hall buried deep within the limestone bones of the castle, a room where the air itself seemed to have been bottled in the 17th century and never changed. The walls were lined with portraits of dead monarchs who stared down with severe, oil-painted judgment, and the center of the room was dominated by the table of state, a slab of black oak so old it had petrified into something resembling stone. Around it sat 12 high-backed chairs, each upholstered in velvet that had been worn smooth by generations of shifting, uncomfortable politicians. At 8:55 a.m., Crown Prince Alexander stood just outside the heavy double doors, adjusting the cuffs of his uniform. The silence in the corridor was absolute, save for the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that sounded less like a timepiece and more like a metronome counting down to an execution. Beside him, Victor stood holding a thick leather portfolio, his face a mask of professional neutrality, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. "They are waiting for you to stumble, Your Highness," Victor said softly, his voice barely rising above a whisper. "Lord Harrington has been the Minister of Finance since you were in short trousers. He views empathy as an inefficiency in the market. He will try to bury you in statistics. He will try to make you feel like a child who wandered into a boardroom." Alexander looked at the heavy oak doors. He didn't feel like a child. He felt like a coiled spring. The confrontation at the banquet the night before had been a skirmish. This was the war. "Let him try," Alexander replied, his voice steady. "Does he know about the Sterling files?" "He suspects," Victor said. "But he doesn't know how much you know. Uncertainty is your only weapon right now. Use it. Open the doors." The guards pushed the heavy wood. The hinges groaned, a low, theatrical sound that announced his arrival better than any trumpet. Alexander walked in. The conversation inside, a low hum of baritones, cut off instantly. 12 men and women, the architects of Eldorian policy, rose to their feet. It was a gesture of protocol, not respect. Alexander could feel the difference. He scanned the room as he walked to the head of the table. There was General Kalin, looking hungover and sullen after the wine incident, his eyes avoiding Alexander's. There was the Duchess of Vanaheim, who sat on the council as the keeper of the seal, looking at him with the amused expression of someone watching a play she expected to flop. And there, at the right hand of the king's empty chair, sat Lord Harrington. Harrington was a man who looked as though he had been carved out of ivory. He was pale, thin, and impeccably dressed in a suit that cost more than the annual salary of a palace guard. He wore small, wire-rimmed spectacles that magnified his cold, watery blue eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply calculated. "Your Highness," Harrington said, his voice dry and papery, "we are honored by your presence. We understood His Majesty was indisposed." "His Majesty is ruling," Alexander said, taking the chair at the head of the table. He didn't sit immediately. He rested his hands on the back of the wood, looking at each of them in turn. "And he has delegated the chair of this council to me. Please sit." They sat. The sound of shifting chairs echoed in the silence. "We have a full agenda," Harrington began immediately, reaching for a stack of documents in front of him. He was trying to set the pace to dominate the rhythm of the meeting. First item, the Fiscal Responsibility Act for the coming quarter. As you know, the global market downturn has affected our export revenues. We are looking at a projected deficit of 4%. To maintain our credit rating, we must trim the fat. Harrington slid a thick dossier across the black oak table toward Alexander. It stopped perfectly at the prince's fingertips. "The proposal," Harrington continued, outlines a series of austerity measures. Primarily, a freeze on public sector hiring, a delay in the infrastructure maintenance for the northern provinces, and a rationalization of the heating subsidy for public housing units. We estimate this will save the Treasury approximately 50 million crowns. Alexander didn't open the dossier. He just looked at the cover. Rationalization, he repeated. That's a very clean word, Lord Harrington. It is a necessary word, Your Highness, Harrington replied, clasping his hands. The subsidy was intended as a temporary measure during the oil crisis of the 90s. It has become a crutch. The current proposal reduces the subsidy by 30%. It encourages self-reliance. Self-reliance, Alexander said, tasting the word. He thought of the studio apartment in Queens. He thought of the radiator that clanged and barely produced enough heat to keep the frost off the windows. He thought of Maria telling him she slept in 2 sweaters because her landlord controlled the thermostat. And what is the projected impact on the average household in the northern provinces? Alexander asked. It's November. The temperature in Oakhaven dropped to -5 last night. In the north, it's -15. The impact is statistical, not existential, Harrington said dismissively. The average household will simply need to adjust their consumption. Perhaps wear an extra layer. It is a question of budgeting, sire. If we do not cut here, we risk inflation. Inflation hurts everyone. This measures hurts. A few. It is the arithmetic of statecraft. Alexander finally opened the dossier. He flipped through the pages, scanning the columns of numbers. To the council, he looked like he was skimming. But Alexander was looking for something specific. He had spent a month decoding the intentionally confusing invoices of the Grand Continental Hotel, finding the hidden service fees and the administrative surcharges that padded the bottom line. He knew how money was hidden in plain sight. He stopped on page 42. Page 42, Alexander said. Item 7B. Administrative Renovation Fund for Ministry Buildings. Allocated budget 12 million crowns. Harrington didn't blink. Routine maintenance, Your Highness. These buildings are historic. The damp. 12 million crowns for damp? Alexander looked up, his eyes sharp. I walked past the Ministry of Finance this morning. It looks pristine. Meanwhile, the public housing block in the East End has had a broken boiler for 3 weeks. I saw the report in the local paper. Did you see it? I do not read the local papers, Your Highness, Harrington said, a touch of frost entering his voice. I read the Financial Times. Maybe that's the problem, Alexander said. He closed the dossier. You talk about trimming the fat, Lord Harrington, but you are cutting the muscle. You want to take heating away from families who are already choosing between food and warmth to save 50 million crowns. Yet, here on page 50, we have a proposed tax break for high-volume export partners that amounts to, let me see, 60 million crowns. Alexander looked around the table. Who are these partners? Harrington stiffened. They are essential to our trade balance. Corporations that employ thousands. Corporations like Sterling Real Estate? Alexander asked quietly. The air in the room vanished. The name hung there like a grenade. General Kalin shifted uncomfortably. The Duchess stopped playing with her rings. Harrington's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened imperceptibly on his pen. Mr. Sterling is under federal indictment in the United States, Harrington said smoothly. Whatever business he had in Eldoria is past tense. Is it? Alexander leaned forward. Because I spent 3 weeks standing behind a desk, Lord Harrington. And you learn a lot about people when they think you're invisible. I recall Mr. Sterling making several calls to a partner in Eldoria. He was very loud. He complained about the cost of greasing the wheels to ensure his tax-exempt status for a new luxury development in the capital. Hearsay? Harrington scoffed, though his face had gone a shade paler. The ramblings of a criminal. Perhaps, Alexander said. But yesterday, while I was waiting for my flight, I had Victor pull the incorporation papers for that development. It turns out, the land was sold to Sterling's shell company by a trust managed by your brother-in-law. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. The ticking of the clock seemed to get louder. Tick, tick, tick. Harrington stood up. It was a slow, rigid motion. Your Highness, if you are accusing me of impropriety, I am not accusing you of anything, my lord, Alexander said, his voice calm, channeling the terrifying politeness of the ambassador. I am simply applying your own logic. You speak of efficiency and rationalization. I agree. We should be efficient. So here is my proposal. Alexander took a pen from the desk. He drew a thick red line through the tax break section on page 50. Then he drew another line through the Ministry Renovation Fund. We cut the tax break for the export partners, Alexander announced. And we cancel the office renovations. That saves us 72 million crowns. That covers the 50 million you wanted to save from the heating subsidy, with 22 million left over. We can use that surplus to fix the boiler in the East End and perhaps give the nurses at the Royal Hospital that raise they've been asking for. He pushed the dossier back across the table. It slid across the black oak and stopped in front of Harrington. That seems like excellent arithmetic to me, Alexander said. Don't you agree, Lord Harrington? Harrington stared at the dossier. He looked at the other council members. General Kalin was looking at the ceiling. The Duchess was looking at Alexander with a newfound, terrified respect. Harrington realized he was alone. The boy had not only outmaneuvered him, he had flanked him. If Harrington argued for the tax break now, he would look corrupt. If he argued for the renovations, he would look selfish. Harrington sat down slowly. He picked up his pen. The arithmetic is sound, he murmured, his voice tight. We will amend the proposal. Excellent, Alexander said. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He turned to the next item on the agenda. Now, regarding the transport union strike. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of capitulation. The old guard, realizing the predator in their midst was not the king but the prince, tread carefully. Alexander moved through the agenda with the ruthless efficiency of a shift manager clearing a backlog of check-ins. He didn't know everything. He had to ask Victor for clarification on legal statutes twice. But he knew enough to spot the bullshit. He knew that when they said unavoidable delay, it meant incompetence. He knew that strategic realignment meant layoffs. He translated their bureaucrat speak into human reality and forced them to vote on the reality. When the clock struck 11 a.m., Alexander closed his portfolio. Meeting adjourned. The ministers fled the room as if it were on fire. Harrington was the last to leave, gathering his papers with shaking hands. He paused at the door, looking back at Alexander. There was hatred in his eyes, cold and reptilian, but there was also fear. When the doors closed, Alexander slumped back in his chair. The adrenaline that had sustained him for 2 hours evaporated, leaving him trembling. He felt nauseous. He had just threatened one of the most powerful men in the country. He had played poker with the national budget. Breathe, Your Highness, Victor said, placing a glass of water in front of him. You forgot to breathe for the last 20 minutes. Alexander took the glass, his hand shaking so hard the water rippled. Did I go too far? You went exactly far enough, Victor said, a rare smile touching his lips. You didn't just kill the efficiency bill. You signaled a regime change. Harrington will be plotting his revenge before he reaches the elevator, of course. But for today, you won. I don't want to win, Alexander whispered, staring at the empty chairs. I just want people to not freeze to death in their own homes. Is it always going to be like this? A fight for every inch of decency? Yes, Victor replied honestly. That is what ruling is. It is not sitting on a throne. It is holding back the wolves, day after day, until you are too old to hold the spear. Alexander stood up. His legs felt heavy. I need fresh air. I need to get out of this bunker. He walked toward the doors, but before he could reach them, they flew open. It wasn't a guard. It was Hugo, the king's private secretary, a man who usually moved with the slow dignity of a tortoise, now running, his face flushed red. Your Highness, Hugo gasped, clutching his chest. You must come. Immediately. What is it? Alexander asked, his stomach dropping. Is it the king? No, sire. It's the plaza. The palace gates. What about them? There are people, Hugo said, his eyes wide. Thousands of them. They heard. Heard what? The leaked audio, Hugo stammered. Someone recorded the banquet last night. The wine incident. Your speech about the wages. It's on the internet. It's everywhere. They are calling it the Red Wine Manifesto. Alexander looked at Victor. Victor looked just as shocked. They are marching on the palace? Alexander asked, his mind flashing to images of revolutions, of guillotines. No, sire, Hugo said, shaking his head. They aren't marching on the palace. They are marching for it. They are chanting your name. Alexander ran. He ignored protocol. He ignored the guards. He sprinted down the long marble corridors, his boots slamming against the stone, the sound echoing like gunfire. He burst through the great hall, past the startled footmen, and threw open the massive double doors that led to the royal balcony. The cold wind hit him like a physical blow, carrying with it a sound that shook the very foundations of the castle. It was a roar, a deep, oceanic roar of human voices. Alexander stepped up to the stone railing. Below him, the vast palace plaza, usually an empty expanse of cobblestones, was a sea of people. There were thousands of them. Dockworkers in gray coats, nurses in scrubs, students in colorful scarves, office workers holding briefcases. They were pressed shoulder to shoulder, filling every inch of space, spilling out into the avenues beyond. When they saw him emerge, the roar deafened him. Alexander, Alexander. It wasn't the polite applause of the gala. It was raw. It was desperate. It was the sound of people who had been unheard for so long that they were screaming to prove they existed. Alexander gripped the cold stone of the railing. He felt a lump form in his throat. He saw a banner near the front. The Receptionist King. He saw another, Empathy is Power. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had carried luggage, the hands that had been scalded by coffee. He realized then that the secret was out. The barrier between the prince and the people had shattered. He couldn't hide behind the mystique anymore. They knew who he was. They knew he had been one of them. But amidst the cheering, Alexander's eyes caught movement on the periphery. Down below, near the heavy iron gates that held the crowd back, he saw a black limousine pulling away. In the back seat, he caught a glimpse of a pale face watching him through the glass. Lord Harrington. Harrington wasn't looking at the crowd. He was on his phone. And even from this distance, Alexander could feel the malice radiating from the man. Harrington wasn't defeated. He was escalating. Sire, Victor appeared at his elbow. Security is advising you come inside. This is an uncontrolled gathering. A sniper could. No, Alexander said, not taking his eyes off the crowd. He raised his hand. The crowd went wild. Let them look, Alexander said. I'm not hiding anymore. But as he waved, a sudden, piercing sound cut through the cheers. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a siren. Then another. Then a deep, mechanical rumble that vibrated through the soles of Alexander's boots. From the east, a column of thick, black smoke began to rise into the gray sky. It was billowing up from the industrial district, the East End. Hugo ran onto the balcony holding a phone. Your Highness, urgent report from the fire commissioner. What is it? Alexander shouted over the noise of the crowd. It's the public housing block in the East End, Hugo yelled, his face pale. The one with the broken boiler. Residents were using space heaters. The grid overloaded. There's been an explosion. The whole block is on fire. Alexander froze. The East End. The very place he had just argued to save. The very people he had just fought for. He looked at the smoke rising like a dark stain against the winter clouds. He looked at the cheering crowd below, who hadn't realized yet that their homes were burning. My car, Alexander commanded, spinning around, his cape swirling. Sire, Victor grabbed his arm. You can't. The fire department is handling it. It's too dangerous. I said my car. Alexander roared, his eyes blazing with a ferocity that made even the unflappable Victor recoil. I am not going to watch from a balcony while my city burns. Get the car, Victor, and call the hospital. Tell them to prep the burn unit. He didn't wait for an answer. He ran back inside, stripping off the ceremonial sash as he went. The medals clattered to the floor, forgotten. The coronation of chaos had begun, and the receptionist Prince was about to clock in for the hardest shift of his life. The armored Mercedes S-Class was built to withstand sniper fire, chemical attacks, and high-velocity impacts, but it was not built to withstand the suffocation of a prince's rage. Inside the cabin, the air was recycled and cool, filtered of all impurities, creating a jarring, sterile silence that clashed violently with the blur of the city screaming past the tinted windows. Alexander sat in the back, his knuckles white as he gripped the door handle, his body leaning forward as if his sheer will could make the V12 engine pump faster. Beside him, Victor was speaking into a satellite phone, his voice a rapid-fire staccato of crisis management, barking orders to the Royal Guard, the hospital administrators, and the police commissioner. ETA 6 minutes, Your Highness, the driver announced, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. He was driving with a terrifying precision, weaving the 2-ton beast through the gridlock of Oakhaven streets, forcing buses and taxis onto the curbs as the lead escort vehicles cleared the path with wailing sirens. Faster, Alexander commanded. His voice was not loud, but it was brittle like ice about to shatter. He looked down at his hands. They were still clean. He hated them. 10 minutes ago, he had been standing on a balcony, accepting the adoration of a crowd that believed he was their savior. Now, he was racing toward a disaster that his own family's negligence had engineered. The irony tasted like bile in his throat. They crossed the invisible border that separated the royal district from the East End. The architecture changed instantly. The limestone facades and wrought iron balconies of the aristocracy gave way to brutalist concrete blocks, gray and weeping with damp. The streets here were narrower, the snow piled high in dirty, uncollected mounds. And then he saw it. It wasn't just a fire. It was a monstrosity. The Sector for Housing Block, a 10-story monolith of affordable housing, was crowned in a halo of black, churning smoke that blotted out the midday sun. Orange tongues of flame were licking out of the windows on the 4th and 5th floors, defiant and hungry. The smell hit the car even through the filtration system, a pungent chemical stench of burning insulation, melting plastic, and old dry timber. The motorcade screeched to a halt at the perimeter. The police had set up a barricade, holding back a hysterical crowd of residents and onlookers. Fire trucks were scattered chaotically, their hoses snakes of canvas tangling in the slush. "Stay in the vehicle, sire!" The head of his security detail, a massive man named Soren, shouted as he unbuckled his seatbelt. "We need to secure the perimeter. The structure is unstable." Alexander didn't listen. He didn't even hear him. He was already opening the door. The noise hit him like a physical wave. The roar of the fire was a low, guttural growl, overlaid by the high-pitched screaming of sirens and the frantic shouts of mothers calling for their children. The heat was shocking, cutting through the freezing winter air, creating a bizarre microclimate where snow melted into slush instantly upon touching the ground. "Your Highness, get back." Soren lunged for him, but Alexander sidestepped him with a fluidity born of adrenaline. "I am not a spectator, Soren," Alexander shouted over the din. "Get your men to the triage line. Help the paramedics. Now." He ran toward the command post, where a man in a white helmet, the fire chief, was screaming into a radio. The chief looked exhausted, his face smeared with soot, his eyes wide with the frantic calculation of a commander losing a battle. "Status," Alexander barked, grabbing the chief's shoulder. The chief spun around, ready to curse at the intruder, but the words died in his throat when he saw the face that had been on every television screen in the country an hour ago. Your Highness? Status, Chief," Alexander repeated, shaking him slightly. "Talk to me. It's bad." The chief choked out, coughing. Hydrants on the north side are frozen solid. We're losing pressure. We can't get water to the 5th floor. The central stairwell is a chimney. We have people trapped on the 6th and 7th. My men are pushing up the south stairwell, but the heat. God, the heat. Why aren't the ladders up? Alexander pointed to the ladder truck sitting idle. Hydraulics seized. The chief spat, kicking the tire of the truck. Maintenance budget was cut 6 months ago. We can't extend the boom. The words slammed into Alexander's gut. Maintenance budget. It was Harrington's voice in his head. Rationalization. Efficiency. This was what efficiency looked like. A ladder that wouldn't extend while children burned. Give me a jacket, Alexander said. What? Give me a turnout coat. And a breathing apparatus. Now, sire, I can't let you. I am your prince, and I am ordering you to equip me. Alexander's voice was terrifyingly calm. I am young, I am strong, and you are short-handed. If you waste time arguing with me, someone dies. Do it. The chief stared at him for a split second, seeing not a royal, but a volunteer. He nodded once. Grab the gear-off engine too. Seconds later, Alexander was shrugging into a heavy, yellow fire-retardant coat that smelled of ash and sweat. He pulled a helmet onto his head, the visor scratched and worn. He didn't look like a prince anymore. He looked like Alex the receptionist, preparing for the worst shift of his life. He didn't wait for permission. He followed a squad of firefighters running toward the south entrance. The heat intensified as they neared the building, a physical pressure that pushed against his chest. Glass exploded from a window above, showering them in glittering shards. Masks on, the squad leader yelled. Alexander pulled the mask over his face, the hiss of compressed air filling his ears. His breathing was loud, rhythmic, ragged. He followed the line of men into the dark throat of the building. Inside, the world was a nightmare of gray and orange. The smoke was so thick he could barely see the hand of the man in front of him. The air was incredibly hot, searing exposed skin. They climbed the stairs. 1 flight, 2 flights. The concrete steps were slick with water and debris. On the 3rd floor landing, they found a huddle of terrified residents. An old man clutching a cat, a woman in a nightgown coughing violently. Get them down! The squad leader ordered 2 of his men. Move! Alexander grabbed the old man's arm, steadying him. Go! He shouted through his mask. Keep your head down. My grandson. The woman screamed, grabbing Alexander's coat. Her eyes were wild, bloodshot. He's up there. He ran back for his toy. Floor 6, apartment 6B. Please. We're going. Alexander yelled back. Go down. He pushed upward. The squad was thinner now. Just him and 2 firefighters. The heat on the 4th floor was unbearable. The fire had breached the hallway here. Flames licked across the ceiling like fluid, rolling over their heads. The roar was deafening. Floor 5 is fully involved. The squad leader shouted over the comms. We can't punch through. There's a kid on 6. Alexander yelled. 6B. We can't make it. Kid. The firefighter shouted back, not knowing who was behind the mask. The structural integrity is failing. We have to pull back. No! Alexander didn't stop. He surged past the leader. Hey! Come back. That's an order. Alexander ignored the order. He wasn't playing hero. He was driven by a cold, mathematical fury. He knew the layout of these buildings. They were standard government issue. The south stairwell was blocked, but the service corridor on the east side might still be clear. He ducked low, crawling on his hands and knees beneath the layer of superheated smoke. He reached the 5th floor. It was an inferno. The walls were blistering. He crawled, his knees scraping against broken tiles. He found the service door. It was hot to the touch. He kicked it open. Clear. The service stairwell was full of smoke, but no fire. He scrambled up. Floor 6. He burst into the hallway of the 6th floor. The smoke here was black, oily. Visibility was 0. He had to feel his way along the wall. Apartment A. Apartment B. The door to 6B was closed. He touched the handle with the back of his glove. Hot, but not melting. He tried to turn it. Locked. "Open up!" he screamed, banging on the door. "Fire department." No answer. He stepped back and kicked the door right next to the lock. The cheap wood splintered. He kicked again. The door flew open. "Is anyone here?" he shouted, sweeping the room with his flashlight. The beam cut through the smoke like a lightsaber. He heard a cough, a small, weak sound. He followed it. In the bedroom, huddled under a bed, he saw a pair of small feet wearing superhero socks. Alexander dropped to his stomach. He shined the light. A boy, maybe 7 years old, was curled into a ball, clutching a stuffed dragon. His eyes were squeezed shut. "Hey," Alexander said, his voice gentle despite the mask. "I'm here. We're going for a ride." The boy opened his eyes. They were wide with terror. "It's hot," he whispered. "I know," Alexander said. He reached out and dragged the boy out. "Hold on to me, tight." He picked the boy up, wrapping his heavy coat around the small body. The child buried his face in Alexander's neck. "Hold your breath," Alexander instructed. He turned to leave. Boom! The floor beneath them shuddered violently. A support beam in the hallway had given way. A wall of fire roared into existence, blocking the door he had just come through. Trapped, Alexander spun around. The bedroom window. It was the only way. He ran to the window and looked down. 6 stories. A sheer drop. The ladder truck was below, still useless, its boom retracted. "Damn it!" Alexander screamed, slamming his fist against the glass. He looked around the room. He needed a way out. He needed a bridge. He saw the fire escape on the adjacent building, Sector 5. It was close, maybe 6 feet away across the alleyway. 6 feet. A manageable jump for an athlete. A suicide jump for a man carrying a child in 70 pounds of gear on an icy ledge. He smashed the window with a chair. The cold air rushed in, feeding the fire behind the door. The flames roared louder, sensing the oxygen. "Listen to me," Alexander said to the boy, pulling back slightly to look him in the eye. "What's your name?" "Leo," the boy whimpered. "Okay, Leo. I'm Alex. We're going to jump. I need you to be a monkey. Wrap your legs around my waist and your arms around my neck. Do not let go. No matter what happens, do not let go. Do you understand?" Leo nodded, trembling. Alexander climbed onto the window ledge. The wind whipped at him. The drop was dizzying. Below, the crowd saw him. A collective gasp rose up, louder than the sirens. Spotlights swung up, blinding him for a second. "Don't look down," Alexander muttered to himself. "Look at the landing." The metal railing of the fire escape across the gap looked impossibly thin. Ice coated the black iron. If he missed, they would fall to the pavement. If he slipped, they would fall. He took a breath. He crouched. He channeled every ounce of strength in his legs, every hour of training, every moment of frustration he had felt in the last month. He sprang. For a second, he was flying. A heavy, clumsy, yellow bird suspended over the abyss. His chest slammed into the railing of the other building. The impact knocked the wind out of him. He gasped, his hands scrambling for purchase on the icy metal. His boots scrabbled against the brickwork. He slipped. No, his left hand lost its grip. He swung dangerously, dangling by one arm, the weight of the gear and the child dragging him down. His shoulders screamed in agony. "Hold on, Leo." He grunted. He kicked out, finding a rusted rung of the railing with his boot. He heaved. He roared, a primal sound of exertion. He pulled himself up, inch by agonizing inch, until he flopped over the railing onto the metal grate of the platform. He lay there for a second, staring at the gray sky, his chest heaving, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Leo was safe. The boy was crying softly into his coat. Alexander rolled over and sat up. He ripped the mask off his face and took a deep, freezing gulp of air. Tasted of smoke, but it was oxygen. He looked across the alley. The room they had just been in was now a furnace. Flames were pouring out of the window he had just jumped from. "We made it," Alexander whispered, hugging the boy. "We made it." The descent down the fire escape was a blur. When his boots touched the ground, chaos erupted. Paramedics swarmed him. Soren was there, looking like he was about to have a heart attack. Your Highness, are you injured?" Alexander ignored him. He handed Leo to the weeping woman who had broken through the police line, the mother. "He's okay," Alexander rasped, his throat raw. "Just smoke." The woman fell to her knees, clutching her son, sobbing hysterically. She looked up at the muddy, soot-covered firefighter who had saved him. She didn't recognize him at first. Then she saw the eyes. "You," she whispered. "You're." Alexander stepped back. He was swaying. His adrenaline was crashing. His shoulder throbbed. He felt a hand on his arm. It was the fire chief. "That was the craziest thing I've ever seen," the chief said, his voice full of awe. "You got a death wish, kid?" "No." Alexander coughed, spitting out black phlegm. "I have a life wish. For them." He looked around. The fire was slowly being contained, but the damage was done. The building was a blackened skeleton. Families were huddled in blankets, watching their lives turn to ash. And then a black car pulled up. Not his car. A sleek, government-issued Jaguar. Lord Harrington stepped out. He was immaculate. His wool coat was pressed, his shoes polished. He looked at the scene with an expression of mild distaste, holding a handkerchief to his nose to block the smell. He was accompanied by a news crew he had evidently summoned. Harrington walked toward the command post, stepping carefully over a frozen puddle. He spotted Alexander, or rather, the firefighter he assumed was in charge. He didn't recognize the prince under the grime and the helmet which Alexander held in his hand. "Chief," Harrington called out, his voice projecting for the cameras. "A tragic day. Tragic. I trust you are doing everything possible? The ministry will, of course, launch a full inquiry into how this happened." Alexander felt the rage return. It wasn't the hot, explosive rage of the morning. It was cold. It was absolute. It was the clarity of a diamond. He walked toward Harrington. His heavy boots crunched on the glass. "An inquiry," Alexander said, his voice raspy but loud. Harrington turned, annoyed by the interruption from a mere fireman. "Yes, an inquiry. Clearly, there were safety violations." "The violations were in your budget, my lord," Alexander said, stepping into the light of the news cameras. Harrington froze. He peered at the soot-stained face, the blue eyes piercing through the grime. "Your Highness?" Harrington stammered. The color drained from his face faster than the blood from a wound. Alexander stopped 2 feet from him. He smelled of smoke and sweat. Harrington smelled of cologne and corruption. "You cut the maintenance budget for the ladder trucks," Alexander said, pointing to the useless vehicle. "You cut the heating subsidy, forcing these people to use unsafe space heaters. You froze the pipes with your rationalization. You didn't light the match, Harrington, but you built the pyre." The cameras were rolling. The microphones were picking up every word. The crowd had fallen silent, watching the confrontation. "Sire, this is hardly the time." Harrington tried to deflect, forcing a smile. "This is exactly the time." Alexander cut him off. "Look at them." He gestured to the shivering families. "Look at what your arithmetic costs." Alexander reached into his pocket. He pulled out the scorched, melted remains of a plastic toy, a small car he had picked up from the floor of Leo's room before they jumped. He shoved it into the breast pocket of Harrington's expensive coat. "Keep that," Alexander commanded. "Carry it with you, and every time you look at a spreadsheet, you remember the weight of it." He turned to the cameras. He looked straight into the lens, addressing the nation. "The inquiry starts now," Alexander said, "and it starts at the top." He turned away from Harrington, who stood paralyzed, humiliated, and visibly shrinking in the glare of the lights. Alexander walked back toward Victor and Soren. He was limping slightly. He was exhausted, He was dirty, but as he walked through the crowd, the people didn't cheer. They didn't chant. They did something more profound. They parted the way, and as he passed, they reached out, not to touch a celebrity, but to touch a comrade. A hand on his shoulder, pat on his back, a nod of solidarity. He reached the car. Victor opened the door. The interior was still clean, still sterile. Alexander paused before getting in. He looked back at the smoking ruins of Sector 4. "Victor," Alexander said quietly. "Yes, sire." "Get the car dirty," Alexander said. "I'm not changing my clothes." He slid into the seat, the soot from his coat staining the cream leather instantly. He didn't care. He sat back, closing his eyes, and for the first time in his life he felt clean. The war had begun, and he was ready to burn it all down to build something new. The leather of the royal Mercedes was ruined. The soot from Alexander's turnout coat had ground into the cream-colored upholstery, leaving dark, jagged smears that looked like bruises on immaculate skin. In any other timeline, this would have been a crisis for the master of the household. Today, it was a battle standard. Alexander sat in the silence of the moving fortress, his head resting against the cool glass, watching the city of Oakhaven blur past. He was trembling, not from fear, but from the crashing aftermath of adrenaline. His lungs burned with every breath, tasting of wet ash and melted plastic. His shoulder throbbed where he had slammed into the fire escape. But his mind was terrifyingly clear. It was a clarity that frightened him. A cold, crystalline stillness that comes only after one has walked through fire and realized that the monsters aren't in the flames, but in the offices that decided the flames were acceptable overhead. "The Prime Minister has convened an emergency session of Parliament," Victor said from the seat across him. The ambassador's voice was low, lacking its usual diplomatic polish. He looked at Alexander with a mixture of reverence and concern. "They are trying to get ahead of the news cycle. Harrington is spinning the narrative. He's claiming the fire was an act of tenant negligence and that your
Intervention.
Was a reckless publicity stunt that endangered professional rescue workers." Alexander didn't turn from the window. "Let him spin," he rasped, his voice raw. "Spiders spin. Kings cut. They will expect you to change, sire," Victor warned gently, eyeing the charred yellow coat, the mud-caked boots, the streaks of black grime masking the prince's face. "Protocol dictates." "Protocol is dead," Alexander interrupted, turning to look at his mentor. His blue eyes shone with a ferocious intensity from the blackened mask of his face. "If I walk into that chamber in a clean uniform, I am admitting that the fire was just an event, a tragedy to be mourned and filed away. But if I walk in like this, I am the evidence. I am the crime scene. I am not changing, Victor. I want them to smell the smoke." The car swept through the heavy iron gates of the palace complex, but instead of heading to the residential wing, Alexander ordered the driver to the legislative hall. The sun was setting, casting long, blood-red shadows across the snow-covered grounds. As the car stopped, Alexander didn't wait for the footman. He kicked the door open. The entrance to the parliament was a soaring atrium of white marble and gold leaf, a space designed to make human beings feel small. As Alexander strode in, the atmosphere shattered. Guards snapped to attention, their eyes widening in shock as they registered the figure marching towards them. This wasn't the polished air they saw on banknotes. This was a revenant. Boots that had crunched on broken glass now slammed against the pristine floor, leaving muddy footprints with every step. The smell of the inferno followed him, a sharp, acrid stench that overpowered the scent of beeswax and old paper. Staff members froze in the corridors, clutching files to their chests, pressing themselves against the walls as if afraid the fire was still burning inside him. He pushed open the double doors of the chamber. The debate had been raging. Lord Harrington was at the podium, his voice smooth and projected, weaving a tapestry of excuses. "Fiscal prudence cannot be emotional," Harrington was saying, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "We mourn the loss of property, of course, but we must not let hysteria dictate the national budget." The prince's actions, while well-intentioned, betray a lack of understanding of the delicate balance of. The doors boomed shut behind Alexander. The sound was like a gavel strike from God. 300 heads turned. The silence that descended was absolute, sucking the oxygen out of the room. Harrington stopped mid-sentence. His mouth hung open slightly. He looked at the soot-stained apparition standing at the back of the center aisle. Alexander didn't speak. He just walked. He walked down the center aisle, the heavy turnout coat swishing around his legs. Thud, thud, thud. The sound of his boots was the only thing in the world. He passed the backbenchers, the opposition leaders, the junior ministers. He saw the shock on their faces, the recoil. He was bringing the filth of the East End into the sanctuary of the elite. He was forcing them to look at it. He reached the well of the house. He didn't take the podium. He stood in the open space between the government and the opposition, directly in front of Harrington. "You speak of balance," Alexander said. His voice was not shouted, but it carried to the rafters, raspy and dark. "You speak of prudence." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the melted toy car. It was a grotesque lump of plastic now, twisted and scorched. He walked up the steps of the dais and placed it gently on the lectern, right on top of Harrington's prepared speech. "This belonged to a boy named Leo," Alexander said, turning to face the assembly. "He is 7 years old. He likes superheroes. Tonight, he is sleeping on a cot in a gymnasium because his bedroom is a pile of ash. He is sleeping there because you, Lord Harrington, decided that a hydraulic valve on a ladder truck was too expensive. Your Highness," Harrington sputtered, his composure cracking, "this is highly irregular. You cannot simply storm Parliament in that state." "In what state?" Alexander asked, looking down at his dirty coat. "This is the state of your kingdom, my lord. This is what you built. You just don't like looking at it." Alexander looked up, scanning the faces of the ministers. "For 1 month, I was not a prince," he told them. "I was a receptionist. I carried bags. I cleaned spills. I was invisible. And because I was invisible, I saw the truth. I saw that this government treats its people not as citizens, but as overhead. You cut costs to balance spreadsheets, but you don't pay the bill. They pay. They pay with their health. They pay with their dignity. And today they paid with their homes." He pointed a shaking finger at the toy car. "That ends tonight. I am calling for a vote of no confidence. Not just in the Ministry of Finance, but in the entire philosophy of this administration. We are done with efficiency. From this moment on, the metric of this government will be humanity. If a policy hurts the vulnerable to enrich the powerful, it is treason. If a budget cuts safety to save coins, it is treason. You have no authority," Harrington shouted, his face flushing purple. "You are the crown prince, not the king. You cannot dissolve the government. This is a constitutional violation." "He cannot," a voice boomed from the gallery above. "But I can." Every head turned upward. Standing in the royal box, gripping the velvet railing, was King Edvard. He was wearing his military dress uniform, but he looked older, tired, and for the first time, completely stripped of his icy reserve. He looked down at his son, the dirty, exhausted, magnificent mess standing in the well of the house. "The crown has the right to dissolve Parliament in times of national crisis," King Edvard stated, his voice echoing. "And I have never seen a crisis more clear than a government that values ink more than blood." The king looked at Harrington. "You are dismissed, Lord Harrington. The Royal Guard will escort you out. An investigation into your finances and the finances of Sterling real estate begins immediately." Harrington looked around for support, but he found none. The tide had turned. The visual of the soot-stained prince against the pristine politician was too powerful. The moral weight was crushing. As Harrington was led away, protesting weakly, Alexander felt his knees buckle. The adrenaline finally ran out. The room swayed. He stumbled, reaching out to steady himself on the lectern. Suddenly he felt hands on him. Not guards. Not doctors. The ministers, the opposition leader, the Minister of Health, even General Kalin, rushed forward to catch him. "I'm fine," Alexander whispered, though the darkness was encroaching on his vision. You are not fine. King Edvard's voice was suddenly right beside him. The king had descended from the box. He pushed through the crowd of politicians and took his son by the shoulders. Edvard didn't care about the soot. He pulled Alexander into a crushing embrace, ruining his own white uniform, pressing the filth and the smell of smoke against his heart. You foolish, reckless boy, the king whispered into his ear, his voice thick with emotion. You could have died. I had to, father. Alexander mumbled into the king's shoulder. I had to know. You know? Edvard said, pulling back to look at his son's blackened face, tears tracking through the grime. You know more than I ever did. I ruled a map, Alexander. You ruled the territory. The king turned to the silent chamber. He kept his arm around his son's dirty shoulders. My lords, ladies, Edvard announced. My time has passed. The world has changed, and I am too old to change with it. I have been a caretaker of tradition, but a fire requires a firefighter. He took a breath. Abdicate. Long live King Alexander. The silence held for a heartbeat, and then it broke. It wasn't a cheer. It was a thunderous, rolling applause that started from the gallery and swept down to the floor. It was the sound of a new era beginning, not with a coronation of gold, but with a baptism of ash. 3 months later, the Grand Continental Hotel was busy. It was the start of the holiday season, and the lobby was a swirl of expensive coats, luggage carts, and the soft chime of the elevators. The piano player was playing a jazz rendition of Jingle Bells. Near the front desk, a new trainee was struggling with the computer system. He was young, flushed, and clearly terrified. A line was forming. A wealthy woman in a fur coat was tapping her foot impatiently. I'm so sorry, madam, the trainee stammered. The system it's freezing. Well, unfreeze it. The woman snapped. Do you know how long I've been waiting? Suddenly, a hand reached out and placed a chocolate on the counter in front of the woman. The system resets in 30 seconds, a calm voice said. The truffles, however, are immediate. Compliments of the house while you wait. The woman looked up, surprised, and her irritation melted slightly as she took the chocolate. The trainee looked to his right. Standing there was a man in a simple black suit. He wasn't wearing a name tag. He had a small scar on his jawline, and his eyes were a piercing, familiar blue. Thank you, sir, the trainee whispered. I thought she was going to eat me. She was just hungry, the man said with a wink. People are always nicer when their blood sugar is stable. Remember, listen to what they need, not just what they say. Yes, sir. Are you the new manager? Something like that, the man smiled. The revolving doors spun. A woman entered. She was elderly, wearing a thick wool coat and a bright red scarf. She walked with a slight limp, but her head was held high. She carried a small bouquet of winter roses. The man in the black suit straightened up. He walked out from behind the desk, ignoring the bewildered look of the trainee. He crossed the lobby, the crowd parting instinctively for him, though they didn't quite know why. Maria, he said softly. The woman stopped. Her eyes crinkled into a smile that lit up the room. Alex, she said. She reached out and touched his face. You look thin. Are they feeding you at that big drafty castle? Not as well as you did. He laughed, taking her hands. The sandwiches aren't the same. I brought you these, she said, handing him the roses. From the garden at the new house. The heating works, Alex. It works so well I have to open a window sometimes. I'm glad, he said, his voice thick. And Leo? She asked. How is the little monkey? He's terrorizing the royal guard, Alexander chuckled. We gave him a scholarship to the prep school. He wants to be a pilot now. He says jumping off buildings is too slow. Maria laughed, a sound like dry leaves rustling. Then she grew serious. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the gold coin he had given her months ago. She pressed it back into his hand. I don't need this anymore, she said. You gave me a home. You gave my grandson a future. But more than that, you saw me. Keep it. Alexander said, closing her fingers over the coin. It's not for you. It's for the next person you meet who looks like they're running away from something. Pass it on. Maria nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. You're a good boy, Alex. Terrible receptionist. But a good boy. I try, he smiled. A hush fell over the lobby. Through the revolving doors, a security detail had quietly entered. Victor stood by the entrance, checking his watch. It was time to go. The motorcade was waiting. There were treaties to sign, budgets to approve, a kingdom to heal. Alexander squeezed Maria's hands one last time. I have to go to work. Go. She shooed him. Don't keep the world waiting. Alexander turned. As he walked toward the door, the guests in the lobby began to realize who he was. The whispers started. Phones were raised. But no one screamed. No one rushed him. There was a respectful distance, a quiet acknowledgement. He passed the front desk. The young trainee was staring at him, jaw dropped. Wait! The trainee called out, forgetting himself. You're the king. Alexander stopped at the revolving door. He looked back at the golden cage of the hotel, the place where he had learned that the weight of a crown is nothing compared to the weight of a serving tray. He looked at the trainee, then at Maria, then at the reflection of his own face in the glass. Older, scarred, but finally truly whole. Not today, Alexander said, pushing the door open and stepping out into the crisp winter air of the city he loved. Today, I'm just the guy who covers the shift. The door spun shut behind him, but the warmth remained inside.